So it's been about a year since our last Bankai theory crafting video where we looked at what Hinamori's Bankai could be. And the truth is, with the advent of that video, I can't help but think we've now tackled almost all of the most popular candidates to receive a new Bankai reveal at this point, whether that's in the anime, in any future manga material, or just hypothetically. Now, there are a couple of other characters waiting in the wings too, characters like Lisa Yadomaru, for instance, but this time I wanted to pivot a little. There are some characters in Bleach who are never likely to achieve Bankai, and yet we've spent a lot of time with them all the same. They've been involved in numerous battles over the years, and we've seen about all there is to see of their Shikai. And one such character who completely fits the bill is the vice captain of the second division, Morechio Omaeda. Look, I know Omaeda isn't the most popular character in the world, but that doesn't change the fact that we've seen quite a lot from this guy. And there's also no denying just how much he's grown over the course of the story. From the oafish, piggish, and above all else, selfish and cowardly rich snob who had barely seen a moment's real battle, to a genuinely passionate and dedicated soldier of the Gotei 13, willing to put himself in harm's way to protect not just those he loves but his captain too, has been a pretty compelling transformation, to be honest. Omaeda is never going to be the most capable warrior on the battlefield, and like I said, I simply don't think, character development or not, that he really has it in him to achieve Bankai. But we've seen a lot of Gegetsuburi, so there's nothing to stop us from speculating as to what it could potentially be. But ultimately, this proved to be kind of difficult. When I say we've seen a lot of Gegetsuburi, I mean this might very well be the most basic and plain Shikai of the entire series. And the funny thing about that is, Gegetsuburi is a pretty standard melee, weapon-type Zanpakutō. It's a hefty ball and chain that Omaeda uses to hit things with. But Zabimaru also has just a hard-hitting yet fairly plain Shikai, yet its true Bankai in particular, Sword Zabimaru, is totally off-the-wall crazy, with tons of utility and power. It doesn't have a specific ability per se, but it is capable of so much. Really kind of riffing on its overarching theme of being an extendable whip-type weapon. Although Omaeda claims his Zanpakutō doesn't have any special powers, is it just a case of him not really knowing it well enough? Another, perhaps even better example is Ikaku's Hozokimaru. This is another really quite basic Shikai, and while the Bankai Ryumon Hozokimaru is also, I guess, basic, for lack of a better term, certainly in comparison to the likes of Sword Zabimaru, it is still a creative transformation, and one that makes perfect sense as an evolution of Hozokimaru as we know it. So, here goes nothing. This is certainly one of the tougher Bankai theory crafting videos I've made, simply because it feels like there is so very little to work with. So perhaps these ideas might feel a bit out there, I don't know. As always, I've tried to make it as true to both the character and the Zanpakutō as possible, but of course, make sure to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video today, perhaps you're new to the channel or you haven't yet hit that button, consider hitting subscribe today to help support the channel that one step further. It really does mean a lot. It goes a very long way, especially at the moment with YouTube really acting up when it comes to views, kind of across the board. So yeah, if you want to see more from the channel, consider hitting subscribe today, and check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games as well. Maybe show some support over there. Either way, your support of me in general is greatly appreciated, so thank you all so very much. Alright, but getting started first though, as always, a brief look at Gegetsuburi itself. With the release command Crush or Crush'em, Omaeda's Zanpakutō transforms into a huge flail. A gigantic, spiked ball attached to a chain that flows from the guard of Omaeda's sword. The Shikai is, well, pretty simple. It's a standard melee-type Zanpakutō, and one that takes the shape of a traditional weapon, and doesn't really offer much more beyond that. Interestingly, the design of OMAEDA'S Shikai has changed over the course of the manga. During its first appearance back in the Soul Society arc, the spikes were incredibly pronounced, whereas in the Rankar arc, the spikes are much smaller, squatter, and more numerous. However, by the time we reach the Thousand Year Blood War arc, it kind of looks like Gegetsuburi's design has returned to its Soul Society arc incarnation, or at the very least has found some kind of middle ground. Considering OMAEDA'S character, I very much doubt this has anything to do with actual growth or strength, and is very likely just Kubo being inconsistent with how he wants it to look. Regardless of the Zanpakutō's perceived lack of utility, OMAEDA himself is fairly proficient in wielding it, as we see him launching Gegetsuburi at range with excellent accuracy to deal enormous damage to enemies, swinging it at a closer range, seemingly preparing to heft the spiked ball without the chain, and yes, even using his Shikai as a shield too. OMAEDA himself notes that there's nothing special about Gegetsuburi, it doesn't have any special abilities whatsoever, though it's totally possible that OMAEDA himself simply isn't skilled enough to have brought whatever latent power Gegetsuburi has to bear yet. But yeah, all of this is to say again that no matter what, Gegetsuburi is one of, if maybe the single most simplistic Shikai in Bleach, which definitely made coming up with Bankai ideas a little difficult. And to be honest, we have had to go pretty far off the reservation with most of them. I've tried to rein it in and keep them as realistic as possible, but the truth is that either we've seen everything Gegetsuburi can do already, which would be very little, or there is a ton of untapped potential beneath the surface, which still means it is left to our imaginations. I still think the closest approximation to this Shikai is Ikkaku's Hozokimaru, and Kubo kind of just turned Ryumon Hozokimaru into a bigger, more elaborate version of its Shikai, which ultimately is what all Bankai are meant to be. But like I said, we actually get to spend a fair bit of time with Gegetsuburi throughout Bleach, especially considering how basic it actually is. Fittingly for OMAEDA, the very first time we ever see his Shikai in Bleach turns out to be, well, embarrassing. As he, flanked by Chojuro Sasakibe and Isane Kotetsu, chases down Renji and Rukia at the site of Rukia's would-be execution after they escape, Ichigo appears in front of the three vice-captains. OMAEDA is the first to challenge Ichigo, releasing Gegetsuburi, only for the Ryoka to demolish the Shikai immediately, punching straight through the spiked ball with his bare hand and shattering it to pieces in one blow. So, not a brilliant first impression. The next time we see Gegetsuburi doesn't come for a few hundred chapters, once the battle in the fake Karakura town begins. As OMAEDA takes on Nerge, a member of Baragon's Fraction, he successfully tricks the Rankar into believing he's slow, before blitzing him, appearing upon the giant enemy's shoulder in a surprising show of speed. Leaping into the air, OMAEDA unleashes Gegetsuburi from above and slings the flail downwards with a triumphant might, the spiked ball slamming into Nerge's head and seemingly knocking him out cold. However, despite OMAEDA's well-earned success, Kubo couldn't quite let him have it, as Nerge is actually mostly totally fine, and is only killed when his comrade, Geovega, launches Soifon at his head. Now, speaking of Geovega, the next time we see Gegetsuburi comes when the Fraction moves to finish off Soifon. OMAEDA appears between them, using his Shikai as a shield to block Geo's attack. Although the strike effectively totals Gegetsuburi as we see it crumble to pieces, OMAEDA does successfully defend both his captain and himself in that moment. Later, OMAEDA uses Gegetsuburi again, this time against Baragon himself, though he spends much of that time lamenting the fact that his Zanpakutō is pretty useless. Using his Shikai, however, OMAEDA demolishes a part of a nearby building and then begins kicking chunks of rock towards the Espada, only to find they all decay before they can even reach Baragon. Much later again, once the Vandenreich transforms the Serete landscape, OMAEDA releases his Shikai against BG9, as the Sternritter interrogates him for information on Soifon's whereabouts. When BG9 instead directs his attention to and attacks Omaida's little sister Moreo, Omaeda, pretty much at point-blank range, strikes the Stern Ritter in the face with his Shikai, but again, sadly it achieves very little. In fact, we see an interesting weakness of Omaida's Gegetsuburi exploited here, as BG9 simply swats the chain aside with his tendrils when Omaeda tries to swing the spiked ball at him again. Omaeda also uses his Shikai to rescue Soifon from the Soul King's overflowing power, which I think maybe demonstrates a deftness of skill involved, because the Soul King's power is on the back of Soifon's head at this point, and Omaeda manages to wipe them out without taking her head off, which I guess is kind of impressive considering he's wielding a huge, cumbersome spiked ball, so that's kind of cool. But then, much later again, we can just about see him using Gegetsuburi to fight off the Hell Hollows in the Hell chapter. So yeah, like I said, this Zanpakutō has tons of exposure. More than the majority of vice captains, to be honest, which is a little frustrating. In fact, it's absolutely crazy to me to see how often Omaeda uses Gegetsuburi in the manga, and then contrast that with the fact that we don't even know what Iba's Shikai is called, and he's the one who's become a captain. But yeah, not a lot to work with in regards to what Gegetsuburi's Bankai could actually be, which leads me to think that we should be trying to keep things pretty simple here too. Again, following the framework set by Hozokimaru perhaps more than anything else. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the Bankai ideas I've managed to come up with. So I've got 5 ideas to go over here, and as always we'll begin with the simplest of the bunch, though in this instance that may turn out to be the most realistic. Activating Bankai. Omaeda leaps high into the air and swings Gegetsuburi upwards, unleashing a massive burst of pressure as he does. As Omaeda holds his Shikai in the sky, Gegetsuburi collects energy around it, and the longer Omaeda can hold it there, the more energy it acquires, as power swirls around the spiked ball. One by one, the spikes themselves begin to light up, indicating the amount of energy collected. Once every spike is lit, the Bankai is at full power. In that way as well, I guess it is kind of akin to Ikkaku's Bankai. Now, Omaeda can unleash his Bankai's attack with even only one of the spikes lit up, but of course the strength of the Bankai is determined by how much energy he's managed to gather in the air. So he's going to want as many of the spikes lit as possible, but once he's reached a sufficient level of power, Omaeda simply swings Gegetsuburi down towards the ground once again. When Gegetsuburi makes contact with the ground, it detonates in an absolutely massive explosion that sends energy waves rippling, pulsing throughout the earth itself, resulting in a gigantic earthquake. The ground is cracked and ruptured, and for every spike that was glowing, another pulsating wave of power is sent streaming beneath the earth, causing the intensity of the earthquake to multiply, essentially ticking upwards on the Richter scale for each spike, increasing the seismic activity. The idea is that depending on how much power Gegetsuburi was able to gain before striking the ground, the spiked ball will produce earth-shaking blasts that spread out beneath the battlefield, producing almighty earthquakes. The idea I had in mind was it was a little like a monstrous drill or something that keeps pounding away at the ground beneath it in order to break through. Of course, this Bankai has some serious downsides. For example, Omaeda has to charge up its power, and to do so, he has to stand still, holding his weapon aloft. Perhaps in the future, once Omaeda has mastered Bankai, he'll be able to charge the Bankai up by continuing to fight with his Shikai instead, allowing him to be both more mobile and to be able to defend himself. But for now, this makes sense to me. It's a very simple Bankai, and one that is totally focused on destruction, with very little other utility. In that sense, of all my Bankai ideas today, this one feels the purest in the way that it is just Omaeda's Shikai, but bigger. It's the exact same as his Shikai in a sense. He just swings his spiked ball, and when it hits something, it deals damage, except this time it causes a gigantic earthquake and explosion. Moving on, let's switch gears a bit. Now, Omaeda has been known to be fairly cowardly in the past. Sure, it seems like he's done a lot of growing up, especially since the battle with Aizen, but him being scared and pathetic is one of his defining traits, and you can't help but wonder if some of that seeped into his Zanpakutō. Gegetsuburi seems to present only one side of the character, so what if his Bankai switched things up a bit? In a way that's similar to how Soifon's Suzumebachi highlights her preferred self, while her Bankai, Jakuho Raikoben, is emblematic of the parts of herself that she doesn't like. That's why for the second idea, for Gegetsuburi's Bankai, we are focusing on defense this time. Omaeda activates his Bankai, and Gegetsuburi, if active at the time, expands rapidly in his hands before seemingly engulfing the vice captain completely. And once the dust settles, it turns out that's exactly what's happened. Omaeda is now encased within a gigantic version of his Shikai, which protects him from attacks. I kind of like the idea of Omaeda's Bankai being so completely cowardly in nature that it does nothing but provide him with a shield after totally swallowing him up. Like, I can picture the manga panels playing out in my head. I can just imagine the enemy expecting the Bankai to do something, but no, once released it just sits there as Omaeda hollers and laughs at them from within. And then when the enemy asks how Omaeda plans on defeating them from within his dome, Omaeda realizes he can't actually do anything. Honestly, in regards to his personality, I think that fits really, really well. You know, an ostentatious blowhard who is very cowardly in the face of battle most of the time, but once he gets himself into a situation that he thinks is advantageous, he'll start mouthing off, he'll start insulting the enemy, and eventually it'll be turned back upon him. And then, you know, from there, I think the Bankai could be used in a multitude of ways. If we want to actually build in some kind of offensive capabilities, it could be that when someone attacks Omaeda's Bankai, the spikes explode outwards, attempting to impale the attacker, or it could be that the spikes can be fired from within the sphere itself, almost like a cannon. In fact, I imagine it taking inspiration from a military bunker or something like that, where there's a huge, practically impenetrable wall, and then just a small hole or something from where the artillery is fired, but therein also lies the Bankai's fundamental exploitable weakness. But I also like the idea of Gegetsuburi's Bankai just being straight up useless, aside from protecting Omaeda, and he chooses maybe to try and make something of it in the moment. Like, again, I can imagine he and Soifon taking on some powerful enemy. Omaeda uses Bankai. Soifon is, like, amazed that he's learned Bankai, but then it turns out it's completely useless save for protecting himself. However, as Soifon, I don't know, begins to get overwhelmed by the enemy, essentially fighting on her own now at this point, Omaeda, inside his protective sphere, is like, no, I want to help, I want to do something, and so maybe it is just a huge spiked ball that surrounds him, but then from inside it, he starts, you know, trying to roll it around to trample and roll over the opponent. Either way, I do like this idea. I think it's kind of versatile, and I think it could work. Alright, next up, this is a fun one. Gegetsuburi itself translates to 5 heads, and so I wondered if there was a way we could incorporate that without going too silly. I initially tried to workshop some kind of idea involving a Hydra, right? But I just don't see Omaeda's Bankai having really any kind of mystical weirdness to it. I think at the end of the day, it has to remain fairly simplistic, fairly grounded. Again, similar to Ryumon Hozakimaru in that way. That's the key kind of tenet of the design philosophy behind this Bankai, but this next idea is definitely one of the more out there theories I've come up with. Omaeda swings Gegetsuburi upwards into the sky, and as he shouts Bankai, the spiked ball glows a brilliant gold. As it does so, it splits off into 5 separate gold spheres which shimmer momentarily. Once the light fades, the chain attached to Omaeda's hilt has split into 5 separate chains, and at the end of each is a solid gold version of Gegetsuburi itself, emblazoned with OMAEDA'S face. Each of the spiked balls featuring a different expression too, as if to insult the enemy. OMAEDA can independently move the 5 chains. This is perhaps the aspect of this Bankai that is most akin to the Hydra theme I was thinking of, and calls the spiked balls to him one at a time before he then launches them at the enemy, almost like a shot put. The catch here is that these spiked balls explode on impact with a giant blast that does immense damage, but it also destroys the spiked ball, meaning OMAEDA only gets 5 attacks with this particular Bankai before it reverts back to Shikai again. As soon as one of the balls is blown up, OMAEDA can immediately move to call the next one to him. Honestly, I actually really like this Bankai idea too. I feel like it comes with a lot of innate personality and would be fun to draw. If OMAEDA'S Zanpakutō was going to get away with having any kind of special power, I feel like it would be explosions of some kind. We'll continue talking about explosions a little later on, but for the 4th Bankai idea, we've got another one that feels a little wild, but again, I kind of like it. This one is perhaps a bit more conceptual than the last, but again, I think it works. You'll have to let me know. When preparing to use Bankai this time, OMAEDA grabs the spiked ball of Gegetsuburi, a little like when he prepares to wield it against Ichigo initially, and pours his Reiatsu into it. Once the ball is full, the chain pops out and falls away, before OMAEDA launches the spiked ball itself into the sky. As he cries out Bankai, the spiked ball inflates to an absolutely colossal size. For reference, I think it would probably look fairly similar to Hisagi's Bankai, but without all the chains. The spikes are pulled back into the black sphere itself as it grows bigger and bigger. The basic idea behind this Bankai is that this sphere becomes a mini planetoid almost, with its own gravitational pull. The vision behind the Bankai being that this Bankai is a portrait of OMAEDA'S narcissistic tendencies, and how being rich and spoilt the entire world has revolved around him from day one. This is that notion personified. So OMAEDA himself is pulled towards the sphere, as is his opponent, but only if they get close enough. So this Bankai is pretty much useless against long-range opponents, although if he was against someone who used a ranged attack, maybe the attack would be pulled into the orbit of the Bankai itself. Anyway, for those who fight up close and personal, they will be ensnared by the gravity's pull. This Bankai also plays nicely, I think, into OMAEDA'S cowardly ways too, as it essentially forces him to run away. His weapon is completely gone in this form, and since he's unable to use really anything else, whether that's Kido or Hakuda to his advantage, well, his Bankai leaves him no choice but to run. Almost as though Gegetsuburi is poking fun at him. However, therein lies the trick to this Bankai. OMAEDA running away is kind of the point. For you see, after the spikes were attracted into the sphere, they didn't disappear completely. Instead, when OMAEDA'S opponent chases him, if they step over one of the spikes, it will trigger a trip mine of sorts and blast outwards, potentially skewering the enemy on this giant spike. Even if the spike doesn't completely score a hit and only sends the opponent flying, they'll be pulled back into his Bankai's orbit and potentially struck again. The spike will come out again if they land anywhere near where it retracted. And finally, this is definitely the loosest theme for a Bankai idea of his so far, but what if we play off that previous idea a little and expand on the concept of using landmines for Gegetsuburi's Bankai? I mentioned earlier that we would get back to talking about explosions too, and honestly this idea is pretty broad, and I feel could take many different forms. For example, first, let's look at naval mines. Now, while I don't think the theme particularly suits OMAEDA, the imagery, I think, works quite well. What if when OMAEDA activates Bankai, a huge field of these mines, taking the shape of numerous Gegetsuburi, litter the battlefield, floating upwards yet held in place via their chains, anchored to the ground. But like I said, that's just one way to portray this Bankai via the concept of mines, as I think there are numerous ways it could work. Maybe they could be depicted not like naval mines, but like more traditional land mines. Get away from the naval theme that doesn't really fit or work for Omaeda, and could instead be scattered about the battlefield, embedded in the earth, with only the slight top of the dome with some spikes showing. Or the spiked ball could multiply many times over, but the chains all vanish, leaving the spheres to float ominously in the air, ready to explode at the slightest touch and maybe set off a chain reaction. Ultimately, I think the concept of landmines, or mines in general, does actually work quite well for Omaeda's Bankai, but at the same time, I think I prefer Gegetsuburi to feature a slightly more active Bankai to highlight the unexpected level of mobility the Shikai actually has, thanks to its chain. But I'm not sure. I'd love to get your thoughts down below. And those are my 5 ideas for Omaeda's Bankai, bringing this video to a close. What did you think? Do you like any of them? Could you see any of them working out for Gegetsuburi or not? As always, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, and make sure to let me know any Bankai ideas you might have for the 2nd Division's Vice Captain. Omaeda, and by extension Gegetsuburi, was a tough one to devise a Bankai for, but actually I think the 3rd idea is my favourite. I love the concept of these extremely ostentatious golden spiked balls plastered with Omaeda's face being launched at the enemy and then exploding. Honestly, I think it works really well, but let me know your thoughts below. In fact, it even plays a little bit into Omaeda's whole don't judge someone based on their appearance thing that he had going in his battle with Nerge. The enemy might not expect the spiked balls to explode, as that's not what a flail does, but they'll be in for a rude awakening. Alright guys, well that's it for today's video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Like I said, let me know your thoughts on Omaeda's Bankai down in the comments. What could it be? What do you think of my ideas? I'd love to know, so do please let me know. Also, consider hitting subscribe if you haven't done already. Check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. And a massive thank you to everyone who supports me over on Patreon. It really is making a huge difference, especially at the moment. Like I say, loads of creators are kind of struggling because of YouTube's whole restricted mode fiasco that's going on, and I have been impacted as well. So really, no matter how you support the channel, whether you're subscribing, whether you're commenting, engaging, you hit the notification bell, or if you are going that step further and supporting via Patreon, it really all helps out massively, and yeah, I couldn't do this without you, so thank you all so very much. Alright guys, until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.